I'm Dr. Jones, Alexandra Jones, with Archaeology in the Community. I'm the executive director, and there's a number of reasons why we're having this panel, why this panel is fitting for this time period. But I would like to introduce all of my panelists and give bios. And in that, what I'd actually like to highlight is this particular panel is near and dear to my heart. If anybody knows me, my dissertation was actually done on the ancient United Order of Brothers and Sisters, Sons and Daughters of Moses. So I am literally Dr. Jones because of this wonderful benevolent society and the resilience of this particular community. So I do have some experience and some knowledge in working with benevolent societies, as well as the challenges that also come up archaeologically and from a historical position in doing this. I will act as the moderator for today as we go through and highlight a number of organizations. We have with us Kelly Britt, who's an RPA, is currently an assistant professor of urban archaeology at Brooklyn College, focusing on community-based historical archaeology of urban space. She received her PhD from Columbia University in anthropology and has worked in a variety of archaeology and heritage organizations prior to coming to Brooklyn College. These positions in museum, government, cultural resource management, and academia have permitted her to civically engage collaboratively with communities where she has worked and lived, for she feels it is important to bridge the gap between scholarship and action in true democratic ways. Her current work is in her own community of Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, working with the United Order of Tents and the Weeksville Heritage Center on projects in and outside the classroom. Last but not least, she's a mom to an energetic, creative daughter who keeps her consistently on her toes and thinking outside of the box. We also have with us Diane Baxter. She is a native Washingtonian. She retired from Lockheed Martin from being a quality control engineer after 38 years of service to the company. What started as a sixth grade elementary project to map out her family tree has blossomed into a full-fledged hobby as an unofficial genealogist. And prior to the invention of computers and the internet, she spent many Saturdays working at the National Archives conducting research. Her family tree has grown over the years to approximately represent 17,000 members of the family. Oh, 1,700, excuse me. She also teaches other individuals how to start and develop their own family trees utilizing many subscription services and public records. She's also a descendant of one of the benevolent societies in which we will talk about today. We also have Ms. L. Paige Whitley, who is an independent researcher whose work focuses on African American history in Montgomery County, Maryland, and the greater Washington, D.C. area. Her interest started when in 2016, she and colleagues uncovered the history of a local African American community and a benevolent society cemetery in it. Her work has resulted in an article tracing a Bethesda, Maryland African American community and its contested cemetery, which was published in the fall of 2017 in the Washington History. Since then, her research has led her to identify the link between a failed Haitian colonization effort attempted during the Civil War and African American communities in the greater Washington, D.C., and she has tracked the life of a formerly enslaved Montgomery County man to his life in Kentucky and beyond. She has spoken at conferences sponsored by the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., as well as that of the Montgomery County History as well. So before we get started, I'd like to give you a little context and history about the topics that we're going to specifically explore today, which is benevolent societies. So Black scholars have been talking about and writing about benevolent societies since the early 1800s. W.E. Du Bois and Jeffrey Brackett both wrote in the 1800s about the importance of benevolent societies to African Americans. According to Du Bois, church and fraternal activities were the center of African American social life. Their real function was to provide a fund for relief in case of sickness and for funerary expenses. The burden, which normally fell on one person or a family, was then spread out in small regular contributions that was made by a larger group. This business feature was then made attractive by a ritual, ceremonies, officers, regalia, and various social features. Fraternal organizations collected dues that funded a rich range of social activities, as well as an essential services such as medical care, burials, loans, and support for deceased widows. National insurance companies systematically discriminated against Black people in their policies into the mid-1900s. Yet other means of obtaining both life and burial insurance became available to African Americans through these fraternal organizations. The Maryland Republic and State Capitol Advertiser noted in 1875 that nearly every colored man in the South belonged to at least one secret society. The number of secret and fraternal societies in the Black community multiplied rapidly in the late 19th century. Being a member of a fraternal organization signified status and position within the African American community. And oftentimes, people were members of more than one society at one given time. Rivaling churches as community institutions, many Black fraternal federations became active in the struggles for equal civil rights. And by the 1920s, fraternal societies and other mutual aid institutions had entered a period of decline by which they never recovered. The many possible reasons for this decline included restrictive state insurance regulation and competition from private insurers. So keeping that history and that in mind, I would like to turn to our panel. So Kelly, you work with the United Order of Tents in New York. Could you give us a little bit of information about the Benevolent Society and the order that you worked with?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you for inviting me here today. It's really a privilege to be on this panel with these amazing women, Diane, Paige, and yourself. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Would it be okay if I share a few slides?
Yes.
For that. Great. Does everyone see those? Is it a go ahead? Great. So I'd like to just start off with a little bit of a history of the order as a organization, and then talk a little bit more about the district that I'm working with, which is based in Brooklyn, New York. So the United Order of Tents was founded in 1847 by Annetta M. Lane. She was a former enslaved woman, and she used the assistance of two abolitionists, J.R. Giddings and John Jolliffe, which you can see in the initials in the official name, the United Order of Tents, JRG and JU. JU stands for Union, the U. In some research that I've done, there's also a Harriet R. Taylor, another former enslaved woman that helped with Annetta, but the research, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenges of doing this type of research in documentary or in archaeology, doesn't always have her name associated, and there's less of a paper trail. I was privileged enough to do some research a couple years ago in Norfolk, Virginia, and I was able to actually visit the resting place of Annetta Lane and her family in the Old Calvary Cemetery in Norfolk, which you can see here. And as you can see just by the image of the angel and her family burial plot, it was a very prestigious, and she held such a prestigious and high status within the community. This is a picture of the Eastern District Grand Tent Grand Order of Tents in Brooklyn, which I have been working with and have the privilege of working with the last few years. And I'll get to a little bit more detail on that in a minute. But as you can see in the corner, slightly you see the JRGJU over here. So who are the United Order of Tents, and sort of what is their mission? The United Order of Tents is a Black women Christian fraternal order. They are a secret society, like many of the fraternal orders that you spoke about just a moment ago, Alexandra. And it's comprised of Black women or sisters from various socioeconomic and religious backgrounds across the eastern region of the US. So most of the information that I'm sharing with today has come from the brief history of the United Order of Tents, composed by one of the members. And this is the information that's generally given to the public to better understand the order and their mission. Originally, it started as an underground movement with connections to the Underground Railroad in New York, but because it was not allowed to formally operate there, it moved to Pennsylvania and was operated formally with Quakers and was formally organized. Like many benevolent societies, their mission was to aid the sick, help bury the dead, and in this instance also assist enslaved obtain freedom, particularly women and children. This being a women's organization, it seems pretty natural to also focus more on women and children. Their mission developed more into organization based off of aid to education through scholarships, supporting the National Negro College Fund, contribution to particular health organizations or associations like the American Heart Association or the National Cancer Foundation. They also help provide homes for the aged and the infirmed, which several of the districts have actually worked even more so in recent years. They help care for the sick, comfort those in distress, orphans of deceased women of all races and nationalities, as well as work with and encourage girls or the youth to achieve their maximum potential in society. So there is a juvenile division to the United Order of Tents as well. I should state also, this is a picture that they put out during one of the Block Association parties, the block parties that we usually have here in Brooklyn in the summer, where we've set up tables the last couple of years, except for this year, to provide more information about the organization and try to attract members. So this is a picture that, as you can see, the tent goes here, and you'll see this image in aspects of the sign as well. So the National Grand Encampment was made up of 4 districts. You have Southern District 1, organized in 1868, comprised of North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, and DC. Northern District 2, organized in 1847, comprised of Delaware, Pennsylvania. Eastern District 3, organized in 1888, comprised of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and then Southern District 4, which was the last to be organized in 1922, and it's just comprised of South Carolina. Some of these districts are more more active right now than others. The way that the organization of the tents works is it's 3 levels: this national level, a district level, and a local level. So the national level is basically made up of the districts with a national body, and it's operated by a right-worthy national grand superintendent and a president of the superintendents that sort of oversees all of them. They convene biannually. The district level, each district is run by a committee of officers. So this is very similar to many fraternal organizations. In this instance, that includes the right-worthy national grand superintendent, the right-worthy national grand queen, the right-worthy national grand deputy, the president of the executive board, president of the corporate board, and worthy leaders who represent individual tents within the district. And these officers really oversee the enforcement of the Constitution, the bylaws, the rituals, the ceremonies, etc. And each district has a physical headquarters. So I'm working with the district headquarters here in Brooklyn, New York. Then you have the local level. So the individual tents that are comprised of sisters led by an elected worthy leader and other officers that meet monthly and convene together through the district on an annual basis. As with all fraternal organizations, and many organizations in general, there's rituals and codes of conduct. So the mission really that exemplified through the regulation and dress, I really want to sort of stress that the dress code was based off of types of meetings and the roles that each person held within the meeting. So white and purple seem to be a very primary color for a lot of the clothing and the robes that would take place for ceremonies and rituals. And if you think of white being a symbol of purity and purple as a symbol of regality and royalty, it really falls into place in terms of rituals of ceremony and meaning within these organizations. Titles, roles in the organization all enforce the important roles that these women had and performed in the community. They were forces of change. These symbols of purple and royalty, et cetera, they really were pillars within the community and still are. Therefore, for me, the tents headquarters is not just a physical building serving this container for this social network, but it's also a space that's created for sisterhood and heritage. On the right, you'll see a commemorative medal that I found in an article, which was found on eBay. And while I don't know what the first part of the acronym stands for, you also see the JRG and JU at the end, and it's presented by Prudence tent number 85. Each tent had a name in August 1861. And this is just a symbol, since I don't have any artifacts per se to show you today, but a symbol of sort of that regalia and that aspect of dress codes, meetings, and the roles within them. So let's go to Eastern District 3. I have a bunch of maps here and some arrows for everyone to follow. We're going to start over here in Brooklyn. So as Brooklyn is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, the Eastern District 3 started sort of in the north central part of Brooklyn in a community called Bedford-Stuyvesant, or otherwise known as Bed-Stuy. And from there, the United Order of Tents actually purchased a house right here in the center, in the heart of the community, which is now within a historic district. The blue line symbols the original historic district, and the red line is the expanded historic district that's recently taken place. The United Order of Tents Eastern District 3's headquarters is located in an amazing building. It was built in 1863. It's a brick. And as you can see from the top picture, while I do not have a date for this photo, you can see the elaborate architecture and the gables and a little bit into the backyard. The bottom picture is from a 1929 picture that was from the New York Public Library. So you can see the back of the house looking south with the carriage house here in the front, and then looking backwards towards the back of the house. The main resident of this house through the 19th and early 20th century was the McMahon family. They were a prominent Irish Catholic family that lived in the neighborhood when the area was more Irish Catholic and Jewish and other nationalities from different waves of immigration that came through New York. As I'll show in a minute, the maps also show that this property was listed as a mutual hospital in the late 20s and 30s. So what I find really interesting is that even the building itself sort of has the bones of a benevolent society and a mutual aid society, even without the tents there, which I think is really quite an amazing aspect of this property. The Eastern District Grand Tent was purchased in 1945 by the tents, and it was served as their headquarters for all the individual tents of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. It's currently listed as part of the National, State, and Local Registered Historic District, but it's not listed individually. Here's a picture of this 1929 map that we recently found, where it shows it as a mutual hospital. And I have heard stories from some of the tents members about it being a hospital in the past. So it's really fun when you are able to sort of link the oral histories to the maps and the evidence that you find in documentary sources. So you see the green little dot here is the actual front part of the house. This back part, small structure, would have been the carriage house, still in place. This is the house today. As you can see, there's been some changes and modifications, not much though. The porch portion has been removed, and there's now this this just single door that you can enter the house from. It still has this regal appearance. It's an amazing piece of architecture within the community. But you can also see that the back portion has been sold, and now a apartment development has been put up in the back. And that sort of gets into this, the nature of historic preservation in many ways. In order to stabilize the wall of the house, a piece of the property was sold to help raise funds to be able to do that. As we'll sort of talk about today, historic preservation and archaeology and doing historic research on these properties is not a quick and easy task, right? So this sort of plays into the part of many of the challenges dealing with older houses and structures. You can see this picture here where this is a 2012 Google Maps photo where the back portion of the property still was open, though the carriage house was removed. And this is a picture of it today with the apartment complex actually created in the back portion of the property. What's lovely though is there's still all of this trees and botanicals that are still associated with the original house, including this giant walnut tree, which provides so much shade and comfort to the house. And from some of the stories that I've heard from some of the daughters of the Tents, and when they were a juvenile, you know, playing in this backyard and having activities in this backyard was an important point of their memories. I'm gonna just stop sharing at the moment. But mainly the point that I wanna bring up, as we'll probably get into a little bit later, is this research is really still on the surface. I've been working with the Tents now for several years, and I do a community-based approach, which means that I work in collaboration with them. And currently right now, their main goals are to become more of to become formally a nonprofit organization and to stabilize the house. So when I think of archaeology, and when I think of a lot of the comments that I'll probably talk about later today, I think of archaeology as this wider umbrella where it's not just excavating the ground, but sort of excavating stories and narratives and telling through those spaces. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about all of that with Diane and Paige a little further. So thanks.
So thank you for that. Paige, if you can tell us a little bit about the ancient United Order of Sons and Daughters, Brothers and Sisters of Moses.
I will, and I'll try to share my screen right now. Let's see. There we go. All right, can everybody see? This is sort of a map of Montgomery County about 1915. And so we're gonna start here with the backstory. And I wanna point out just a few things for those who are joining from elsewhere and are not the local history nerds of the area. Maryland was a slave state that sided with the Union during the Civil War. As a result, it has a very mixed bag of race relations embedded in its history. And to give you a background, from the Civil War to about 1900, the population estimate of Blacks in Montgomery County, Maryland, was about 35 to 38%. And in 1950, it was 6%. So maybe some of the things we're discussing might shed light on why that drastic change in population. What you see before you, I've tried to identify different benevolent societies in Montgomery County. And before looking at them, I want to also point out in this lower right-hand corner, the District of Columbia. We have here the nation's capital, the melting pot of ideas of influential Black pastors, religious leaders, intellectuals, pedagogic teachers who are leading the forefront during segregation for Black education in the segregated system and stuff. So always right here and trickling down and through the county on some levels are the influences of that DC community and the Black society there. But within Montgomery County, we are talking basically about a very agriculturally based county for the most part, until we see in the 20s and 30s the growing development of suburbs surrounding the District of Columbia and out along the rail lines. Most of these historic Black communities were settled by formerly enslaved and who quickly built a community based on the pillars of faith, setting up their church, the pillar of education, setting up a school for their children, and benevolent societies, mutual support for aiding each other when they were sick, unable to work, in the cases of death, helping those families with funeral costs and a burial site, and also helping with orphans, etc. The earliest of the benevolent societies that I have found to date, and I'm sure I'm missing some. In fact, I think there's a Good Samaritan I missed in here, but was an order that I'd never heard of, and maybe somebody in the audience can shed light, the Order of Light and Truth Circles, which at least we know is there in 1875. On the opposite side of the county, over here near the Potomac River in the small community of Martinsburg, we have the Association of Love and Charity. And it's definitely there by 1883. In fact, there is now the Warren Historic District where you can visit and see the schoolhouse, the restored Loving and Charity Hall, and the Methodist Episcopal Church side by side in that community. Not far from here, we had the Selman Lodge of the United Order of True Reformers near Dickerson. And in the center at the county seat in Rockville, we had the United Order of Galilean Fishermen, who were definitely there by 1903. And in 1917, bought land to set up a burial plot, the Fishermen's Cemetery, for its members, which then became the Lincoln Park Cemetery, which is now overseen by the nearby Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and is one of the largest of the historical Black cemeteries in the county. Sprinkled throughout in my little hot pink symbols are the Oddfellows, which seem to have a huge percolating effect of buying and selling land between 1909 and 1925. And then we come to our purpose, the Order of Moses. And you might notice that with all of these names, I have been trying to use a short form. And for this reason, the Order of Moses, short form, is for Ancient United, or in some cases, Ancient Independent Order of Sons and Daughters, Sisters and Brothers of Moses. And here locally, within the Montgomery County, we had a lodge or tabernacle number 74 in Emery Grove. Emery Grove being a traditional encampment site for Black churches in the summer, and it was set up right next to Washington Grove, the traditional white encampment site for churches in the summer. They are there, their deed shows them in existence in 1892, and they were formally incorporated in 1924 in the state of Maryland. Southwest of them, Mackles Lodge was in the Norbeck area of Montgomery County, and it has both a deed and formal incorporation documents dating to 1895. And then we have the topic of our discussion today, Morning Star number 88 of the Order of Moses in the Gibson Grove African American community of Cabin John, okay, here with the large star. But I've also, and that we know from different sources, has been around since 1885. And Diane, when she talks about specific artifacts, can talk about that too. We have deeds from 1901, we have incorporation from 1933, but it is through an artifact, the minutes book, that we learn that one of the founders of the community says she herself had been a Morning Star since 1885. Here along the district line, I've included just two of many Order of Moses tabernacles that were located in the District of Columbia. And why these? Because of proximity and relationship with the Morning Star Order of Moses. We have a Georgetown order called Early Rose Tabernacle that dates to about 1887. But even earlier, we have what is called White's Tabernacle number 39, which dated itself to 1870 and is in the northwestern part of the District of Columbia called Tenleytown. It was a very active member of a booming settlement following the Civil War, a very mixed settlement of both white and blacks. And it did have a Moses Hall located behind a church that served not only for the meetings of the group, but as a social center in the community that served for social activities, political meetings, etc. And down the road, they had a cemetery as well that they had purchased land for in the 1880s. In 1911, that organization purchased land across the border here in Bethesda, Maryland, as a new site for its cemetery. And we will see later that that community of Tenleytown is pushed out during the 20s and 30s by urban renewal projects, parklands, etc., and a new vision that the city had for the area. Now, but what was the ancient United or Independent Order of Brothers and Sisters, Sons and Daughters of Moses? The asterisk is there to caution you to not confuse it with a very similar named organization that started in 1904 in Virginia by J. Murray Jeffries, which was called the Grand United Order of Moses. The ancient United Order, or the Order of Moses that I'm going to say from now on, was conceived by one Peter Paul Brown of Philadelphia. He was a seaman who had spent some time in the West Indies and purportedly went through some physician training, although that was called into question during an inquiry at one point in Philadelphia. Nonetheless, in 1865, the first Order of Moses Tabernacle was established in the Philadelphia suburbs. And again, shortly thereafter, White's Tabernacle in Tenleytown is being established in DC. In 1872, Brown registered with the Library of Congress a huge organizational chart of his vision of this organization. And you can go see that at the Library of Congress once COVID is over, if you'd like. Despite those with far more knowledge of benevolent societies in the US can speak to this perhaps, he engaged in a legal spat with DC organizers who were forming a similarly named organization. And from my perusal of all the literature is that this was not uncommon as people vied to sort of who is in control, who is the leadership of such an organization, as organizations had splinter groups and started up. Nonetheless, by 1879 in Baltimore alone, there were 11 tabernacles. There were about 1,600 members, and the Order of Moses was spreading throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest states. We see the growth here ourselves in Montgomery County and in Early Rose Tabernacle of Georgetown. 1911, as I said, White's is forced to purchase new land across the border for the burial of its members. And then we have the challenges of trying to understand secret societies through public documents. For example, news articles in 1923 say President Coolidge receives a delegation from the Order of Moses, and it quotes 250,000 members in the order, and yet I haven't yet confirmed that number. There you go. In 1929, there were supposedly 6,000 plus members in DC. And then in 1950, we still have annual meetings and gatherings, and yet the membership is hovering around 4,000 or so. So that's the national order, the main order. But locally, what does it mean? Well, here's a 1913 photograph that the Board of Education took when it was investigating schooling, segregated schooling and such in Montgomery County, of Mackle's Lodge in Norbeck. And we have a classic interrelationship epitomizing a Black community. Education, the school for Black children on the left, that in the 1920s was rebuilt with funds from the Julius Rosenwald Foundation. In the background, we have the Moses Hall, and behind it, the cemetery for its members. The cemetery exists to this day, as does the Rosenwald School. The hall is gone and is now a parking lot. On the right, the church, which also still exists to this day, the Methodist Episcopal Church, showing that intertwined nature of the community. So in Cabin John, you might think I'm starting backwards because this is a real estate map from 1958, but it's basically built on the history of this community. We have here on the right in the yellow box, the Gibson Grove AME Zion Church, which came into being formally in 1898 when Sarah Gibson donated land. She was a founder of the community. She donated land for the formation of the AME Zion Church. However, years earlier, she and her husband, Robert Gibson, had already donated a small piece of land to create a log cabin for the purpose of educating, schooling the children of the community, and creating a house of worship. And we know from news articles that the Gibson Grove circuit was in being and was being met by preachers in the 1880s before that formalization in 1898. So we had school, church, and across the way, the Moses Hall, surrounded by its cemetery for its members. We don't know the actual date to the building construction of the Moses Hall. However, with regard to the cemetery, our earliest documented burial is actually Diane's great-grandfather, James Coates, from 1894. And we believe there may have been even earlier burials. For example, the husband and son of Sarah Gibson, who died in 1880s and early 1890s as well. In this cemetery, we've identified through death notices in the newspaper, those death certificates we could get our hands on before COVID shut everything down, between 70 and 80 individuals buried at the alternately known as the Cabin John Moses Cemetery, number 10 Cemetery, burial from Gibson Grove Church to Moses Cemetery, etc. in the records. Along the street here, what is now called Seven Locks Road, named for the 7 locks nearby on the C and O Canal, are descendants of the original owners who bought land between 1885 and 1887 in this area. The only 2 changes that impinge on the future as we see it or are currently happening is in the last plot of land formerly owned by Gibson Grove member Charles H. Brown was bought in 1941 by the US government, in particular the US Navy, to create housing for its Black workers at the nearby David Taylor Model Basin facility, which was down the road. That transaction was not without some controversy and shades of racism in the destruction of the home that was on it and belongings in it. And then what you see here intimates what is about to happen in the next few years. The State Highway Administration comes in and creates the 270-495 spur of the highway system, physically separating that core of the community, the church and Morning Star Hall and burial ground. The school by this time had long since been closed by the state board during segregation times. It had bounced between the log cabin, the AME Zion Church, and rental space in the hall before it was closed in 1931. So I'm going to stop here so that Diane can allow us to see some of the amazing things that this community has retained.
So with that said, one of the things that I would highlight and ask you all to think about, oftentimes when we talk about archaeology, people automatically think to excavating and digging in the ground. And one of the unique spaces that historical archaeology occupies is that not only do we look at the material culture that is below the ground, but we look at what's above the ground and what people have interacted with, still use, and still have. So Diane is going to actually speak to the artifacts and the material culture as a direct descendant of a member of the ancient United Order of Sons and Daughters, Brothers and Sisters of Moses. So Diane. Diane, I think you might be on mute. Okay. All right. So what we'll do is we'll just let her log off and come back in so she can enable her audio. We'll give it just 2 seconds for that. Sorry about the technical glitch.
I honestly don't know.
There we go.
Oh, wow. I my apologies. I don't know what happened. So I'm good? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. Oh, I'm disabled. Okay. Okay, my apologies. As I previously said, this is not my personal artifact from the tabernacle, but it is a book of minutes that was discovered some years ago. The Moses Hall facility was destroyed in a fire back in the 60s, 1960s, by some young white teenagers who were intoxicated. And as a result of that, the entire building was destroyed by the fire. And what is left now is some of the foundation and perhaps some of the other artifacts that are buried there that we haven't discovered. But a man was hiking through the woods and discovered this book. And lo and behold, this book ended up being a book of minutes from the organization dating back from 1904 to 1914. This book ultimately now resides in the Montgomery County Historical Society's library, which I had the opportunity to visit there and actually see the book. I actually read some of the tattered pages, and made a few discoveries that my great-grandmother was a member of the organization. So this is now has been scanned, and it is available online for review. Go to the next page. With the contents of the book, we discovered that the membership year was from September to August, and they held meetings on alternate Wednesdays throughout the month. The agenda for the meeting followed what they called a standard ritual, where the meeting was opened up with a conductor who examined the house, meaning the individuals that were there on the right side and on the left side, and the statement made that all individuals are qualified to be there. They would then form a circle and sing their secret hymn, and then conduct a prayer. They would then have the members repeat their obligation as a member of the organization, and the meeting was then declared as being open. There was a rule of officers called, and the minutes from the last meeting were read and then approved. They noted anyone who was absent, and then they went to their various reports. One major report was that of a sick report and relief, where members who were ill and could not attend the meeting had to provide a certificate that they were ill. The certificate came from their doctor, and as a result of that, they were financially compensated. There were other reports given in terms of potential candidates, banking information, some other financial information, and they also discussed any burials and any insurance-related issues. Then they would go through if there were any resolutions coming from the organization, and then close the meeting. And as I said, this happened twice a month, basically. Go to the next slide. Found in the minutes of September the 11th was information that gave us a better idea of the membership. In this report, they indicated it was 75 members, all of which who were financial. One person had been reinstated, and they actually transferred from the juvenile division of the order to become regular members. And you can see from this meeting that they provided compensation relief to 13 of the members, and they also discussed the fact that one member had been deceased. What you have now is actual artifacts from my family. Lucille Harvey was my great-grandmother, and she lived from 1877 to 1957. This was found among her belongings that had been passed down to me from my family. We don't know what the inscription initials stand for. However, it is the Ancient International Order of Moses. Another artifact I found was a rituals book. And it was a rituals book that was dated 1934, and it was from the Ancient Independent Order of Moses. And the idea of this book was to give information and policy to all of the affiliate associations of the order to let them know how to conduct a meeting. It gave specifically within the table of contents the opening of the meeting, the order of business that they were to have, and the actual closing of the tabernacle meetings. In addition, it talked about how you initiate the candidates and their obligation to the order, and how they installed new officers. It also talks about the burial ceremonies and the various emblems that they would actually affix on the casket of one who passed. And this again was found among my great-grandmother's artifacts. Also in her artifacts was the following ribbons. She had a number of ribbons that date from 1937 to 1941. And she apparently was very active in this organization because she went to a great majority of the meetings, the annual meetings that were held in September of a given year, and the meetings were held in Washington, D.C. So this was the annual national gathering of people in the organizations. Okay. And then lastly from her, many, as was mentioned previously, many of the individuals were members of several organizations, several orders. So she was also a member of the Columbia Temple number 422, and this is the improved Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks of the World. This was also held in Washington, D.C. And as mentioned, there's a sick relief element within some of these orders, in most of the orders. And this was her book of where she was ill and how she documented the financials that was given to her whenever she was sick. So you can see in many instances there was small amounts, but it had to be documented and approved by members of the association that you see as part of the ruler, the sick committee, and the associated secretary. So they each had to verify that they're giving out of money. But one interesting thing for me is that it indicated when she joined the organization, which was August 17, 1929. My next artifact is very similar to the previous one in that this belonged to Elliot Spriggs, who was Lucille Harvey's son-in-law. He lived from 1905 to 2001. And what you have before you is he was a member of the Morning Star Lodge number 40. And I found I don't know if it's his first one, but he was at least a member from 1927 through 1946. I also found a button that commemorated the 32nd anniversary of the organization. And it's interesting that that was also called Morning Star. I also found a Morning Star Constitution and bylaws, which again went through all of the things associated with the organization and the actual things that they had to follow, their policies. Next, we have something that is not from my artifacts, but belonged to another descending family, the Crawford family. This sword was owned by Peter Carter Harris. It was a commemorative sword and scalpel for the Morning Star organization, number 88. And you can see this is the actual sword, and this is the actual scalpel that it would insert itself. A closer look at this particular area is in the second picture, and you can see the actual inscription of United Order of Moses that was actually contained on the sword. And that is my last artifact to share with you at this moment. Okay. Unmute. We can't.
Thank you. Now that we've introduced everyone to the benevolent societies that, or the two specific ones that we're looking at, what I'd actually like to discuss is something that we commonly don't talk about, which is what are some of the challenges that we actually experience in doing this work. So Kelly, if you could tell us what are some of the challenges as an archaeologist that you've experienced and encountered?
Well, as an archaeologist, particularly a historical archaeologist, working with documents, as Paige and Diane have also illustrated, it's, finding these little bits. I think, Paige, you described it well yesterday about these breadcrumbs, and trying to find that information, particularly when you're dealing with secret societies. I mean, there's a reason why they're secret. There's a reason why this information is kept from the larger public. And I think that's one key aspect of challenges that I've seen. There's also not a whole lot of just general information written about benevolent societies. So even coming to looking at the role within the region, within the country, et cetera, there's not a lot of historical documentation on that, whether it's primary sources or secondary sources. And then what is challenging but also extremely rewarding for me is, because I'm a community-based archaeologist, working directly with that community, building that relationship is probably the most important, but also challenging in terms of trying to find the people that are associated with the organization. For myself, I moved to the area in 2011 and became interested immediately in the house and learning more. It took until 2017 to actually meet someone from the tents, and it was due to my landlord, who had known of my interest and was driving down the street and saw someone at the house, stopped the car, got out, and actually spoke with them and called me at the same time. So like that, those connections are kind of hard to create without a network already in place.
Paige, what are some of the ones that you've encountered doing independent research?
Well, the dichotomy of trying to trace the breadcrumbs, dealing first with what is available through public documents that can be found and what can be built around those. And then I will admit, I'm not a community historian, or that is my challenge, is I find an issue or something attracts me and I want to learn everything I can and share that, but then how to meet those of that community, and does that community still exist? And so that's come up in one or two spots. And yet, for example, Diane presents the wonderful sword that is owned by a descendant. I first learned of a sword digging through piles of little newspaper references, talking about a driver at the city jail selling tickets, and in response to why, so that he could buy a ceremonial sword for parades of the Order of Moses for their special services. And so, I'd heard about that or I read about that, and then suddenly we have the actual artifact to emblematize it. Mentioned in the Morningstar Minutes shares some of the background to organizations of, yes, we give our dues so that we can participate in the annual ceremony or the anniversary sermon or this and that. And so the illustrations there.
So I will jump in a little bit on this. As a community historical archaeologist, being very honest and open, it's very challenging work. When I embarked on this study in 2008, you experience a lot of challenges. First being the community and trying to find information about a secret organization. That's the first, because the information that you're given by the larger community are all the coded names. So for me coming in, all I'd ever heard of was Moses Hall. Moses Hall adjacent to the church. It was not until further digging did the story of the Benevolent Society come out. But we also have a unique situation where our particular site is a cemetery site. So then the challenge of doing genealogical work, finding descendants, and then once you find descendants, why are you doing this work? What do you get from this? Questions of agency and intent. And are you going to actually harm us, or are you going to do, what's kind of your bigger picture? And those are things that I had to contend with. Those are real questions as archaeologists, as researchers, as academics, that you have to question yourself about. Is this solely for the purpose of advancing your career? Or is this a larger mission that's ingrained in this? And for me, it was larger. And so that's kind of why I'm back now, 10 years later, involved in this work and doing this work, is that, and being honest, as most historians, researchers, you can easily walk away from something. Once you've written your paper, done your publication, you can always walk away and always say, oh, I'm busy, or oh, I'm on a new project. To me, it's a real statement when you use the work that you've created for good and for the betterment of the community, because at the end of the day, they helped you. and in whatever way that was, they gave to your career, they added. And I almost feel like it's a paying your dues sort of thing. You owe it. And then just, it's our responsibility. And I am blessed because I will say I have a wonderful descendant community that I work with. They're a delight and a joy, which also makes it extremely wonderful as a researcher to have those great relationships. But in that, I will ask Diane, being a direct descendant, what is some of the challenges that you experience in working on a project like this, which requires history and knowledge and family things that may not have always been discussed or talked about?
Well, as it was mentioned, I started this very early in my life as a sixth grade project to build and display my family tree. And as a result of that, I spoke to my grandmothers, to get more information about my ancestors. And in that period of time, family members were not freely speaking of the previous ancestors rather. So knowing that there was a National Archives building organization, I spent many of my Saturday mornings searching through the microfiche rolls, trying to find information about my ancestors, and also documenting all of this on paper. So as the advent of computers and the internet, and I was able to locate a family tree software that allowed me to search the ancestry.com that was provided by the National Archives. And in doing so, I actually discovered my great-grandfather's information in terms of when he was born and where he was, when he died and where he was buried. And of course, at that time, I knew nothing about Moses Hall, the cemetery, or Cabin John. I did know that he did live up there in Cabin John, and his wife and children lived there, but we were also, I'm a native Washingtonian, so it was still pretty foreign to me. So as I tried to search that information and in the internet, I discovered Alexandra's thesis, which gave me much more information about Moses Hall and the cemetery and Cabin John. So of course my curiosity piqued, and I was able to visit Cabin John and where I thought the cemetery was with a cousin, and we did discover the cemetery through the neighbor that lived next door to it, and we have since become friends. And then I discovered that I wanted to go back to the Moses Hall book that I also learned about, and I discovered more ancestors. When the governor announced that he was going to widen the Beltway, by that time I had joined the Cabin John newspaper, newsletter, so I was getting information about the area, and in it to talk about a meeting that was forthcoming to discuss the widening of the Beltway. And it was there that I found more information about Moses Hall, the cemetery, and the surrounding community, and the rest is just history. I find that I'm able to find ancestors that I knew of but did not know where they were. So this has been my greatest challenge in trying to find individuals and ancestors and descendants. But since joining this group, I have met other descendants from Moses Hall who have family members buried there, and we have developed a bond and a new community. So
you've all brought up really good points. And something I want to highlight is that everybody has mentioned secret societies, combing the archives, looking for things. One of the things that I would like to highlight is the silences of the archives. Also keeping in mind that most of these societies were during a time where African Americans were not written about, were not talked about. So beyond texts written by Black scholars, which is why when I started this panel, I refer back to two scholars who were writing during that time. There are books put out by and about African-American benevolent societies solely addressing this, but oftentimes, because of the fact that they're written by Black scholars, many current day historians never think to go back to those texts and find. There's also the Negro Encyclopedia. The Negro Encyclopedia chronicled all things about the African-American life during different time periods that also give you information about benevolent societies and groups. The one thing I will say, at least for the ancient United Order of Sons and Daughters, or the Order of Moses, we'll say for short, in referring to the Negro Encyclopedia, when I did find a mention of it, it was wonderful. There was a question mark next to it. So that severely perplexed me, because of most of us who grew up in my age bracket, we know you go to all things to the encyclopedia as a younger person to find all information. So to actually go to an encyclopedia and see a question mark really threw me off. But one of the things that I want to highlight is, beyond the fact that they're already secret, is that African Americans were very much omitted from the history books and from the stories and from the accounts of this time period. And they're actually things that we still see happening to this day. So what I would actually like to kind of segue into is social justice around preservation and these spaces, because what I find very interesting is all of these organizations were created during a time where national insurance companies discriminated. They didn't have the opportunity to purchase insurance, to take care of their families. And during this very difficult time period in US history, what you did have was a group of very resilient people who created their own and said, if the system won't allow us, we will make our own. And this was very much a result of that resiliency and this, we will not kind of yield. We're not going to be a victim. We're instead going to take the reins and move forward. So with that being said, one of the things that we also see happening right now is social justice issues, but around preservation of these very important African-American spaces and landscapes. So Kelly, would you like to talk about some of the things that you're encountering and what that looks like in 2020?
Yeah, thanks. I think you bring up an excellent point, and it's really what drew me to the tents and to help them with this research, is that the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy has been a historically Black neighborhood from basically around World War II on up, and with the dawn of the 21st century, the area has been primarily gentrified. I'm a product or a part of that as well, even though I don't own. I moved into this neighborhood, and at the same time, I wanted to explore my responsibility in this, and as well as look at how the community as a whole can preserve the heritage and maybe fight back gentrification. I mean, I think I have a lofty goal, but you got to shoot for the stars. So I've done a lot of work with historic preservation, and my dissertation was actually focused on a preservation site in downtown Lancaster. It was the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith site, which was going to be torn down, and as part of a new convention center and hotel. And because of the history associated with Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith and the archaeology that was done, that we believe there was some Underground Railroad activity associated with that. And there's now been documentary evidence found to corroborate the archaeology. We were able to save the houses, but not only were we able to save the houses, these sort of ceremonies and rituals that were part of the community, particularly the African-American community in Lancaster, were resurrected. So Juneteenth began to be celebrated again. They started to have parades again on Juneteenth. There used to be celebrations at Thaddeus Stevens' grave every year by the African-American community in Lancaster. And seeing as this use of historic preservation to sort of really create a heritage resurrection as well, I thought would be something that the United Order of Tents House could do here. It's such a pillar and was a pillar of the community and still is, architecturally, and what they do as a benevolent society. So I sort of see housing and sort of seeing historic preservation as a way of almost as a form of a right to the city, as David Harvey calls it, or as Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it, abolitionist geography. It's like reclaim, this area has been redlined. It's been heavily gentrified right now. How can we sort of push back the developers, or those wolves in sheep clothing, as one of the Tents members have graciously and wonderfully sort of talked about, those people that you're not quite sure what their intent is, right? How can we push them back and use this heritage as a form of bringing that community together? And now, since we're in the middle of COVID, this neighborhood was heavily hit for COVID at the peak back in March and April. So I see the mutual aid societies and benevolent societies sort of coming to the forefront of the community conscious again. And new benevolent societies and mutual aid societies rising up. So I see this more grassroots organization really transforming the community in many ways. Hopefully this can be a part of it.
Awesome. Paige, can you speak to the site that you're working on with the Order of Moses?
First, I have to declare I am not a Marylander, outsider, New Englander, etc. However, as I learn more and more about my surroundings, and first hearing sort of the white history of Montgomery County, which has been the main platform for much, and now other platforms for bringing to the forefront African-American history in the area. And I look at the Gibson Grove community in particular, that was just kind of very small, very localized, and I actually looked through everything that had ever been written about Gibson Grove and who were those authors and where were they perspective and such. In Gibson Grove, that area is surrounded by historically designated homes from the background, and not one is related to African-American communities, such as this one that was right in the midst, and that was part of this greater role. And so I guess for me, it's a matter of injustice that the voices were silenced, and they should not, just as the highway paid no attention and silenced the community and split it and is threatening to do it again. And so for that reason, I think that we need to preserve that which we can. And in this place, we have a church, a hall remnant, and a cemetery that is entire and complete, although it may not be perfect in the eyes of some. It has some headstones, some rocks, some unmarked, etc. But with greater research, it can be pulled forward to be a shining example of what was going on throughout Montgomery County, and which we're all trying to learn more about now.
So for Diane, can you speak as a descendant, preservation and the social justice of this landscape, and what does that mean to you, and what does that look like for you?
Well, my family came from a long line of farmers, carpenters, scaffold builders. They were upholsterers, painters, and ministers, and just plain old ordinary people who were proud of the little bit that they had, and they worked hard to keep it. So they were not rich in wealth as much as they were rich in the deeds that they performed, and still do that to today's environment. My family would share the little bit that they had with each other and their thriving community. They were resilient, and over the years, they survived a world that we all heard about and know about, that looked upon African Americans as enslaved to do the work of their enslavers. So it's not hard to imagine that those who were able to buy their freedom for themselves and their families, they fought long and hard to keep what they had in their possessions so that they could leave it to future generations that were to come. I am a part of the inherited free generation. I was excited to learn about my Cabin John family, and I actually walked the roads that they traveled. I was able to see where they lived and know about and see the land that they own. However, today I'm saddened because I have learned of the potential disturbance of my family's final resting place in Moses Hall. I'm not of the age where I was not of age when the Beltway was built, was constructed, and I didn't know about Cabin John or Moses Hall or its cemetery. I guess the fear that I have today is that the world around me are not concerned about my family. So the fear suggests that the world around me is only concerned about themselves, maybe like they were in the 1960s. So the sacred burial grounds of my family, my ancestors, and who knows what happened to them? Nobody can answer that question. What happened to the burials that were there? Did they toss them aside or what? Were they moved? No one seems to know. So the result of that horrendous effort did provide more effective travel for people on the Beltway, but it doesn't answer the question. And today, when you look at the Beltway, it's right up against the Moses Hall Cemetery. So the fact that the governor wants to widen it, once again, is not the solution to what he's calling his congested traffic problems. So I say no more. The descendants say no more. We won't do this again. You cannot destroy our sacred land and the communities that we have built that have stood the test of time. I declare that there is no justice to repeat this disruption of our family and of our lives. So we've already paid that price and are not willing to give any more. Yes, these are modern times, but why do they think that it's okay to continue to destroy the integrity of what this country is made of? So this is a well-established and historical community that has survived the test of time. It is made up of many residents who are descendants, there are newcomers, and those who have their very roots that are buried in the Moses Hall Cemetery. They live on a land that was passed down to them by their ancestors and older generations. So this has created much pain in my heart to think that my loved ones' resting place may be disturbed once again. We must come together as descendants, as organizers, as community. We must come together in great numbers to stop this atrocity that is forthcoming.
Wow. So just to make sure everybody understands, because I'm not sure if you caught it initially when Paige showed her map, but the Order of Moses and Gibson Grove is abutted by, for anybody who lives in the DMV region, by the Highway 495. Like we all know 95 and how it wraps around. 495 is the Beltway in this region. And in the 60s, when they first built it, they already abutted the cemetery, and what you actually see now is a lot of erosion from the rain. And so part of the cemetery was slowly destroyed. Currently, in talking about preservation, in talking about maintaining spaces, this historic space that has been there since the 1800s now is threatened. And there are issues where State Highway Administration is essentially arguing that there's going to be some destruction of the cemetery. And one of the unique things that makes this landscape really important from an archaeological standpoint in addition just to the fact that it is a cemetery where people have been buried as recent as the 70s in this cemetery, is that the foundation of the Moses Hall still exists. And that's something that we don't have anywhere else in Montgomery County. So there is way more that can be learned about this community. There's actual immediate descendants of the members of the organization who live in the neighborhood. So when you talk about destructive practices and when we talk about preservation and importance of preservation, this is one of those situations where we see there is a landscape that can be preserved. We can learn a lot more. We can add to the history, but currently, in the argument of modernizing society, we see this potential destruction and this continued idea of social injustice and destroying history and heritage, which is quite important to the people in this community. So what I would like to do is open up for questions. We wanted to give it a little bit of time if anybody had any questions. And I think we do have a few. I'm not sure if they've been answered or not. Tammy, are there any questions?
Yes, we had a few questions that was answered, but I want to go ahead and I'm not sure if Kelly wants to talk about what she responded back to Grace or not. But the first question was, let me get back there, was answered. Why were white and purple the primary colors worn by members? What did these colors represent? Do you want to go ahead and elaborate?
Sure, I can do that. This is my neighbor, Grace, so it's really wonderful to see her on here. According to members that I spoke with, the white and purple, like many colors representative in benevolent societies and other organizations, fraternal orders, were meant to sort of represent their virtues and their mission. And because this is based in a Christian mission and a Christian ideology, the white's really sort of a purity, and purple is more of this regality and royal, and generally used with a lot of, depending upon what level and what role you're playing in the organization. I can find out more specific information as to, in fact, I have some written. Last summer, I was privileged enough to write an online piece with one of the members. And we went into more detail about how that, what they wore, when they wore it, what colors they wore, etc. So we can go sit on the stoop and have a social distance discussion about this, which would be great.
I can just add that just through sources, I mean, one funeral announcement for a member of the Order of Moses, it was directed to members for the females to wear white to the funeral services. Again, that we don't have very much information from the minutes book about any colors or other things going on for Morning Star, but for the Order of Moses within the District of Columbia area, that was one of the later, I think it was from the 1940s, I believe. You know, that was one of the directors in a death notice, your general description of who had passed away, specifics for the orders that person had been belonged to, that had, you know, belonging, and white was ordered for the women.
Interesting. So. For the tents, it was black for funerals, so.
Well, and this was just the women. The women were wearing white. I'm assuming the men were wearing black, but that was the directive. So,
great. Okay, our next question also was directed to Kelly. Can you tell us anything about Southern District #1 that included Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina? It's a two-part question. Where is or was the district headquarters? Where it was located, where were the local tents located in Maryland? And are there still any operating cemeteries that's doing their work?
Thank you. I don't have any specifics on Southern District 1, but they do actually have a pretty active website. And so I included that in the answer. It's www.unitedorderoftents.org/heritage/. And they have you can find more information there, and they are active. They are still active. So hopefully that will provide at least a rabbit hole to go down to find more information.
The second question is open to any speaker. Why didn't the members try to maintain secretly their native African languages or religions? Why didn't they strive to maintain secretly their native tongue or religion?
So to answer or to kind of bring up that one, there's another thing that pops up is that when you talk about Africanisms and retentions, keeping in mind time, when you're talking about oftentimes within this generation, people who've been in the US 2 or 3 generations down. You also have to take into account assimilations amongst groups. You had people from different ethnic groups, from different locations all throughout Africa brought together. You also have to take into account that you had people who also lived in the Caribbean as well, who were being brought enslaved into the US. So it's very hard to think about keeping a native language when it's a language that may have died out a generation or 2 generations before, that wasn't maintained. And in addition to that, how do you maintain cultural traditions when you're so diverse? And then you're bringing a group of diverse people culturally together and asking, how do you choose whose culture or whose language is more important than the others? So you do see examples of retention, but unless you're looking at a group that came specifically together under the umbrella of ethnicity, or specifically, it would be hard to then choose whose religion or whose language are you going to choose over everyone else's.
And I think just within the terms of slavery, you have the separation of families. The language is normally from one generation to the next within that. And if you are torn apart, how are you imbibing that and giving that lesson?
Okay, we have a question here. This is open to anyone, open question. What would you ask the public to assist, what would you ask the public to do to assist the preservation of the Order of Moses Cemetery?
So if you are interested in assisting or helping with preservation, I put the email in the chat. If you could email the Morningstar Moses scj@gmail.com, then we can more directly answer or give you information on how you can assist and help with that effort. So I did put the email in the chat itself to everyone, so you have that.
An anonymous attendee asks, what are the Odd Fellows?
I don't quite understand every single organization, but there are actually 2 strands of Odd Fellows: the Independent Order of Odd Fellows and the Grand United Order of Odd Fellows. Both have their roots in England, as many of the organizations in the United States started, except for those that became purely Afrocentric. And they also followed similar patterns of ritual mutual support. They had male and female sections to their orders. And again, community building, community support, as well as ritual and civic mindedness, you know, and the Odd Fellows continue to today and do various things. So I only know in the most generalized term, and if somebody else can add to it, please do.
So Tammy, I'll go ahead and just we had one question that was directed to the group chat, and it was about the sword. It's a very interesting artifact. Can you go over its use in the Order of Moses and where it's kept today? So to talk about where it's kept today, it actually belongs to a direct descendant. So it's actually kept with them. It is particularly owned by their family. So it's held on to and kept safe by that particular family. As far as use, when we talk about ceremonial use, thinking about going through ceremonies, you have your sword on your side. It wasn't used in a utilitarian sense. So no one was chopping and slicing or anything, but it was used for a more official to have as part of your regalia, your uniform, to show your status. Paige, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, parades. Big gatherings with specific periods within a big convocation or conference, etc., would have a period where everybody would dress up in what they had, referring to somewhat the medallions and ribbons that Diane showed, as well as the swords. And you get little glimpses of rituals. One early article where whites were complaining about noise, which was kind of trumped up, but one of the rebuttals was, it's just a ball rolling on the floor as part of the introductory ritual for new members. And so you get another little tiny glimpse of what's secret in the organization. I can tell you that the descendant said he used to find it in his grandfather's closet and play with it. But his grandfather didn't really tell him anything about it. He has learned more about the organization and its role in ritual through the work that has come out through the community. And so, as so many artifacts, as Alexandra mentioned, maybe just lying around and playthings from one perspective, from a youth.
Okay, one last question. How can we access the recording of this wonderful program and share it with people who should hear and see it? Please provide a link.
So this will be downloaded, saved to AITC's YouTube page. We'll also upload it to our Facebook as well, so it can be archived and accessed publicly. And what we'll do is we'll post the link on our website. It should be up on Monday for everyone to access it, but we'll post the link there. We'll also put it out on social media platforms so everybody can know where to actually access it. But it will be on our official YouTube page, so you can access it there. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate you sitting around. Hopefully we enlightened you, taught you a little bit about benevolent societies that you didn't know, as well as some of the social justice issues that are taking place in current day around these landscapes that are important. Again, if anybody is interested in assisting or helping, you can access, at least for Morningstar, through the email. And thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra.